Okay, so now we are ready. So, welcome everyone to our next College of Professional and Global Education Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Justice Committee webinar. We're very excited to have Professor Tsosie with us today, who's going to speak with us about framing of Indigenous data sovereignty and discussing current issues, how the concept's being articulated to advance the interests of Indigenous peoples at the local and global levels. In addition, there will be an examination or discussion of certain applications of Indigenous data sovereignty that raise novel ethical and legal issues. So I'm not going to read your whole bio, but Professor Tsosie has a long list of accolades and comes to us as a regent professor and also a professor of law at University of Arizona. So welcome, Professor Tsosie. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's great to be here, and I do apologize for the tech issues at the very beginning, but I'm so glad that I can connect with you, and thanks to everybody for joining this session, and thank you, Michelle, for arranging this. This issue of Indigenous data sovereignty is relatively new in the field of Indigenous peoples' rights. And I started working on it in 2016 when I joined the University of Arizona faculty. I went there from ASU, and I had a contingent of very young Indigenous scholar colleagues who were working on this issue in the context of public health research. So they weren't lawyers. And they were looking at the various issues with respect to Indigenous people's rights to data in the area of healthcare. And that was something that was very important to me to think about, because I had come from Arizona State University, which had the incredible misfortune of being the institution that was responsible for a researcher misusing blood samples that were taken from Havasupai tribal members during the 1990s for a diabetes project. And then they were later used for secondary purposes without getting consent from the original participants or the tribe. And that was an awful case. It was settled out of court, so we never got a holding on the merits. And the holding that the tribe wanted to have was that all of those blood samples of its members essentially had a form of tribal DNA and information that should not be used and should not be shared with other researchers for all of these random purposes, including human origins, where did people migrate from, and blah, blah, blah. So they were antithetical to the tribal interest, the tribal narrative of its own identity. And so that was the issue that never got resolved. So not only was it misuse of tangible blood samples, but it was misuse of the data associated with those samples in other research studies. So I thought that was a very important issue, and I started to work with my young colleagues and from a legal standpoint kind of explore these issues. So I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about the way that Indigenous peoples and scholars that work with Indigenous peoples, many of the researchers that we are working with are Indigenous researchers from the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. All of those countries share a common legal heritage from Great Britain. And so the framing of issues tends to be very similar, as well as each of those countries has a history of colonization that we now refer to as settler colonialism. So the Indigenous peoples are quite differentiated from the settler peoples, and yet now we have these pluralistic societies that have to have legal systems that mesh with each other. I have always done my work in the United States with federally recognized tribal communities here, as well as other tribal communities. For example, in California, where you are, Michelle, as many people know, there's a horrible history of genocide that basically led to a lot of the tribal groups not having their treaties ratified. They were locked in a vault. So some of those tribes lack federal recognition today. And because of the genocide, many of them are affiliated in contemporary tribes that are composed of many historic Indigenous peoples, sometimes with different cultures and languages. So that whole idea of what is a tribe, what is a tribal government, who's federally recognized, who isn't federally recognized, that tends to get into legal status designations. But for our purposes today, I want to invite us to think about Indigenous peoples, regardless of those status designations across countries, throughout the United States, and even in Hawaii. Obviously, we have Indigenous peoples that are not Indian, American Indian or Alaska Native, and yet they are certainly Indigenous and have these customary laws. So that's how I'll be talking about Indigenous peoples' rights. And I will be talking about Indigenous law, which I use to refer to the customary law of Indigenous peoples. So for example, in the Havasupai Nation, there were a set of customary norms that governed individual and tribal collective interests, tribal stories, the use of physical samples. All of that is governed by a customary understanding of the power that is situated in each of those locations. That is under an Indigenous epistemology. Western societies often can't even understand that because there is a concept that there's a spiritual or cultural harm that results from the misuse of biological samples. And that is not something that the external world validates. So Indigenous customary law is incredibly important in this discussion. I will also refer to the law of the nation states. So US law frames the US sovereignty as a territorial construct of the nation state, and we have control over our internet and our information systems and all of this. So that would be national law. And then international law can be international treaty law between and among nations. For example, the climate treaty. Or it can be international human rights law, which really governs the rights of Indigenous peoples as collectives in a moral sense that should be expressed politically in the legal systems of each nation state. But it's more prescriptive at this point. It's not a treaty per se. It's a prescriptive set of norms about how you acknowledge and recognize Indigenous rights. So I just wanted to give a little summary before I get going so people don't get kind of bogged down in those categories. Okay. So with respect to Indigenous data sovereignty, the way that it is framed internationally among Indigenous peoples is the claim that Indigenous peoples ought to control the collection and use of their data, meaning any data about them or about the territories, resources that they are in association with. Many times this has a personality to it. A river can have personhood, as we see with the Maori people. So any data that's collected about their river, which they steward, is affiliated with them. So they have a collective and comprehensive way of viewing people and environment kind of all together. And data collected about that, they believe, is very important for them to have a role in. Now, why is that so? On a legal level, we would say because they are asserting a right of self-determination, and that is the human right of a group to express its autonomy as a people. And that is in association with territory. That is a moral right under international law. It's also a political right in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And in 2007, it was extended by consensus in the UN General Assembly to all Indigenous peoples. So the idea is they have a right to self-determination, but it has to express within the nation state. So they don't have the right to secede and form their own nation, so we can't carve up the United States. But the United States has to deal with Indigenous peoples on the level of a people with that collective right to self-determination. So that's at the root of what we're talking about with Indigenous data sovereignty. It includes two forms of data. All the data that has been collected about Indigenous peoples in the past, and that is quite comprehensive. The Indian Health Service, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the census people, the healthcare industries that work with Native communities on an outpatient basis. The prison system has Native prisoners in it. The US military has Native servicemen in it. So you can see that there's a lot of data that's been collected about Indigenous peoples, and it sits all over the place. So question one is, well, how are we going to treat all of that data in all of these repositories where it now exists, including libraries and archives? The second level is to say, we need to look at data practices very critically, because the data is then used to make policy recommendations. It's interpreted to say X amount of Indigenous peoples are in the prison system, X amount of Native students never graduate from high school, X amount of Native people are not literate. So there are all of these interpretations that flow. And one of the concerns of Native scholars was that there's a deficit model for that. So they're saying, well, how can we, get Native people to catch up with the rest of the world? They're in a deficit position. So what kind of social programs or whatever, everything's in the sense of being rehabilitated from the tragedies of colonialism. But that's not a positive framing. So Indigenous data sovereignty advocates say Indigenous peoples also ought to govern the collection and use into the future. What are the research studies? They should have Indigenous peoples guiding those studies, involved in those studies. Who's funding the studies? Federal agencies, philanthropic organizations. Well, there should be Native participation as that rolls out. Is this something that we want? And you see that happening in the Biden administration in particular. They have rolled out this policy that says we ought to recognize the traditional ecological knowledge of Indigenous peoples on the same level as Western science. So if we're documenting climate change, we should work with Indigenous peoples to say, what are you seeing? What does this mean? A lot of data is going to go into databases, but the idea is it should be with the consent and the participation of the Indigenous peoples involved. So it's a partnership with agencies. So that would be the model that we see. Okay, so why is that a good idea? And the kind of theoretical grounding as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion really comes, I think, from, in my estimation, from the work of a philosopher, Miranda Fricker, who really wrote about women's place in kind of society and law and policy, and the way that women had suffered a form of what she called epistemic injustice. And that is that dynamic of being invisible in some way. You're visible in a way, but you're also invisible in a way, because the metrics for the world and for success and all of this are set up according to, in her estimation, a patriarchal type of a norm. So she said, epistemic injustice relates to the knowledge practices of a society. And there are essentially two forms. When a group is omitted from creating the meaning around a certain category, that is a form of what she said hermeneutical injustice, because then the categories only reflect the dominant norm. And so she uses the idea of, for example, sexual harassment law. There wasn't a category until the late 1970s, right? The fact that the boss acted in a weird way toward his woman's secretary or whatever, that was just the way that boys were. And, you just had to kind of deal with it. So it's that there wasn't a category in the law for that until there was a notion that women had a right to be treated with respect, to be equal in the workplace, to, all of these things that would facilitate equal employment opportunity, but the law had to grow to that. So that's an example of being excluded from creating the category until a later point in time. So you're invisible. The second one, she says, is how we look at what groups are saying and either weight it as credible or not credible. And she talks about that as testimonial forms of injustice. And so, for example, and this is what I've talked about in my work, with respect to the issue of sacred sites on public lands. There are a bunch of high-profile cases about that, right? San Francisco Peaks in Arizona, Oak Flat in Arizona. These are big Indigenous, high-profile cases about sacred sites on what are now public lands. And how do you protect that? Well, there isn't really a category for a sacred site in Western public land law. So that's a form of hermeneutical injustice. So how are you going to prove that up? Is it some kind of religion? Hey, we're a secular state. We're a federal agency. We can't be pandering to different group religious things. That would not be a good way to do public policy. There's a credibility deficit. How do we know that your religion demands this? Can you be, Navajo and not have this belief? Like, how fundamental is it? That's an example of epistemic injustice, both in the framing of the category and who can speak to the fact that it is a sacred site. And what does that mean? For the Apache people at Oak Flat, it means that this practice that they have had, which is a cultural practice that enables young women to come into adulthood and maturity in the way that is spiritually supported, centuries ago, back to time immemorial, at that same place. There actually isn't another place that you could do that. That place is going to cave in when they turn the land over to the copper company and it becomes a big sinkhole. There will be no more place left. There will be no more place for those women. Is that a problem? Is it a public land problem? So that's what her work does. And so I use that framing, saying data sovereignty is one of those knowledge practices that will make things visible that currently or in the past have been invisible. And that is necessary, particularly in my view, and in the view of Indigenous data sovereignty colleagues, because in a settler colonial society, the Indigenous peoples have to conform to a set of laws about property and ownership and intellectual property rights, et cetera, that came from a different society and was intended for a different use, primarily economic. So it omits all of the cultural, spiritual, and other values that Indigenous peoples have. So that is why it is so important. Okay. So that's kind of the framing. And so to give you just a little snapshot of, how this actually works in the sense of a terminology that you may come into contact with at the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk about two kind of ongoing efforts that will involve input from libraries and archives and information specialists. So I'll just share that with you and invite your ideas. But I think one of the first things I want to talk about is as we work together in partnership, because I'm not a librarian, I'm not an archivist, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, so in terms of all of those categories of Western expertise that work with different data sets, I don't have that training. So we have to work in partnership to figure out what the data structures are, what the knowledge practices are, and then what the better form of practice would be. So in the first part of what I'm talking about today, I want to talk at that conceptual level just so that we can talk about this together across disciplines. The second part, I'm going to be pretty brief, but that's about the legal framework that I think is helpful to understand both Indigenous national law and global international human rights law. So that could be its own lecture, but I'm just going to give little snippets that I think are important for people to recognize. And then I will talk about what Indigenous data sovereignty advocates are framing in terms of the kind of best practices framework. So what would the scaffolding look like for a better set of knowledge practices? And that's the institutional part of it. And then finally, what are the big picture themes, again, reflecting back to DEI issues, and how are we going to deploy those going forward? So I'm just going to hit each of those briefly, and then we'll move into discussion. So at the first level, the conceptual level, there is, I think, there's a need to kind of parse out these issues. So one of the challenges is that data practices are in this form of extreme innovation and change right now. So there is a transformative discussion about data, about big data and artificial intelligence, which uses different forms of data. And so the whole idea of what our knowledge practices are and how we're working with data is in such a state of flux that I think it's really important to make that a concrete discussion, because it may be that some recommendations are better suited for some uses and not for others. So just at the outset, these are the things that data sovereignty could inform. The ethical and legal practices of data storage, data access, data ownership, and when do you need to get consent, privacy interests are usually constructed at an individual level in the United States. Is there room for a collective group form of privacy? And that could go to photographs, for example, or information that is gathered about different practices. The second big set of issues is around intellectual property rights, frankly. So databases are incredibly important repositories of knowledge. And if the data is de-identified and you don't have those privacy considerations, it's very possible to innovate in those data fields and create new things. And that's where artificial intelligence, comes in. And then those people can get a patent, right? Those people can get intellectual property rights. And yet the information that went into that may come from a lot of different places. So in terms of that property rights economic thing, what's happening and who's getting exploited, who's vulnerable, who's getting exploited in that. And the third level is with respect to research. So research practices, and that's where the disciplinary part of it comes in. There can be a code of ethics, maybe. I was talking to a group of archaeologists because they have a big digital data repository that goes on several continents and it all links up. And so that's the human origin stuff is all in that database, right? And one of the researchers I asked, when was your ethical code put in place? Does it say anything about that? And they said it was last retooled in 1998. So that was a long time ago, right? So things have changed since then. So with all of those disciplines, we need to kind of get a snapshot on what the ethical practices are and how should they be modified. And so that would all go in that category of research. With respect to data sovereignty and data governance, those two terms can also be teased apart. This is another conceptual issue to think about. Data sovereignty fits with the idea of Indigenous peoples as having that form of group and collective autonomy that's associated with self-determination. In the United States, federally recognized tribal governments have a legal and political right to their sovereignty. So they are more like states or foreign nations and less like stakeholder groups, because there are a lot of stakeholder groups that want their own associated governance of data. But the sovereignty argument just gets you into kind of that parameter of governments negotiating things. Data governance is its own thing, right? So that is different than data sovereignty, and the idea of governance of data is very contested right now, I think, because the private companies collect tons of data through their apps and they manipulate it and they benefit from it. And we consumers don't even know half of the time what they're doing with the data that they collected about us, right? And so to what extent can the government even, control that? How do we even know what they're doing with it? So data governance is a big thing in the United States and abroad. And we can talk about that more in Q&A if you're interested. The idea of tribal data is now a category. It was very contested when I gave the first version of this paper. I gave at a number of law schools right around 2017, 2018, 2019. And people just freaked out. The scholars at the law schools were like, tribal data, it doesn't make any sense. What kind of category is that? But we wanted to frame something that would encompass those past data practices and everything that had been collected, as well as going forward. And so Indigenous data sovereignty says there's a category of tribal data and it's associated with the tribe. It always has been associated. The only question is, how is it going to be recognized today? And I think that's actually gotten a lot of traction. So gotten a lot of people who are incorporating that into best practices. Okay, so let me just move on to that second category about the kind of legal framework. So in the United States, the federal government does have the sovereign power to regulate the internet and all of the systems that actually conform to that. And other nations have that same power. So to some extent, each Indigenous people is kind of under the sovereign nation, and they can only participate up to the point that the national government allows that. So this has come into play, for example, because a lot of Indigenous peoples want to take down sites and information that they think has the information that shouldn't be accessible to other people about their cultural practices or photos, or they would like that taken out of, but if it is in the quote public domain, then it can be used, right? So that's where the nation state sovereignty kind of comes in. So in the United States, federally recognized tribes are working with agencies, federal agencies, museums, archives, collections around what the data practices are for their particular tribal community. But they can't do anything global that really affects other tribal communities. So the data governance agreements that I see happening right now are usually between the federally recognized tribal government and whatever the agency or institution is. And it's around that tribe's data as it is encompassed in that institution. And it conforms with federal law. It also conforms with tribal law to the extent that these data practices are currently affecting the tribe or its members. So that would be in the sense of best practices for federally recognized tribal governments. For other Indigenous peoples, non-recognized groups, Native Hawaiians, Indigenous peoples from other countries. The idea of Indigenous data sovereignty is an international human rights construct. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the 2007 document that I referred to earlier that recognizes that all Indigenous peoples have an inherent moral and political right to self-determination. And that expresses on two levels. The nation state has to engage Indigenous peoples as equal to all other citizens and groups in that society. So they have equal employment, education, health, whatever. There's that equality of citizenship because they can't secede. But the nation state also has to recognize their collective political right as a people. And so Article 31 of the UN Declaration is the article that says Indigenous peoples have a right to their cultural heritage, inclusive of data, inclusive of knowledge, inclusive of material cultural heritage, their sacred objects, their ancestral remain, all of that belongs to Indigenous peoples, always belongs to Indigenous people. And the intellectual property rights, if any, associated with material cultural heritage also belong to Indigenous peoples. I'm paraphrasing. It's a very long document. But why is that significant? It's so significant because the United States in its laws always differentiates material cultural heritage, the sacred site, the sacred object, the object of cultural patrimony. They always delink the material object from the knowledge that is associated with the object. And the idea is intellectual property rights are for new knowledge, new innovation, new patents, right? New, not for old knowledge. But Indigenous data sovereignty says, it's the composite. Cultural heritage is the item and the associated knowledge about the item. And that's the way the law should protect it. So that in a nutshell is where we're going in the international treaties on climate and on climate adaptation are tracking that. Okay, I'll move through the rest of it more quickly. So the kind of idea of where the framework is going to go, this is where we can definitely work together. The global knowledge practices are informing the knowledge practices of nation states in climate, but also with respect to food and a bunch of things that are important to the international community in a time of climate change, water, so UNESCO is working on these issues of data sovereignty. And there are kind of emergent things happening, and I'll just fold in the new updates so that you can think about this. So the World Intellectual Property Organization is moving into a treaty process around genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge in a way to de-link the equitable interest of Indigenous peoples from having this appropriated by the biotech companies that are bioengineering food and medicines and things of that nature. So that's happening right now. And the UN Permanent Forum just met last week. I couldn't go, unfortunately, but part of the discussion was about the knowledge practices and what are the best things to do. This is an area where there are seed banks, there are data repositories around plant knowledge. So that's happening right now. The other thing that is happening is the idea of standards. So there's a draft that the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, it's IEEE, they are the standards people. And so there's a draft document that has been in process over the last 2 years that is trying to standardize the categories so that across countries and institutions, we can actually define Indigenous data, what is protected, how it belongs to different groups, how it's named, how it's compiled. And this is a whole best practices document. Right now it's out for consultation with Indigenous peoples. And then I think it will go into the institutions to see, you know, how different actors, maybe some of you have already seen it. But that is what we need, right? Because these are global issues. A lot of institutions, universities, funders, you know, corporations, so we need a standard practice to deal with that. So those are two things that are happening right now. And in the last minute before I turn it over to the Q&A, and thank you, Michelle, for moderating that, because I usually get going and then I neglect the chat and do all kinds of awful things because I'm so excited to talk about this. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is, can we turn around that dynamic of epistemic injustice and really focus on this as a way that we could actually benefit all of society? And that's the DEI part, because Indigenous peoples, yes, they've been marginalized and exploited, and so have a lot of other groups. For example, I was just recently at Harvard, and repatriation of Indigenous ancestral remains has been a problem since the beginning. The Peabody Museum there has a collection that still has Indigenous remains, but they also have the remains of African American people. And for the first time, I saw that discussion about kind of the morality of those collection practices in the last century and how we looked at these people. And was there a better way to do this in the future? And there was a whole conversation about that knowledge and the moral practices, the epistemic practices. There's some version of that for a lot of groups. And so maybe the focus on Indigenous data sovereignty will enhance equity across groups and make the knowledge practices better. And in that sense, I see a big driver of this happening around big data, around ownership of data, around artificial intelligence and machine learning and the data sets. And there's a whole conversation about equity and bias, and what goes into the machine comes out of the machine, but you may not see, you know, what that was. So we need to make explicit and visible the components of our knowledge practices so that we can all understand and dialogue across these categories and across peoples in a way that really opens the idea of equity and practices that prevent the exploitation and marginalization of groups into the future, because that's what we don't want. That's what the legacy of what we've had. Can we recalibrate that? So it's been an honor to share these ideas. I hope they made sense, and I'm just really excited to talk to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is not my area of expertise at all, so I took like 3 pages of notes and I have lots of questions. However, I want to ask the audience here if they have questions. I'm happy to unmute you and you can verbally ask your question, or if you want to type it in the chat, or if you needed clarity on, you know, any of, there's so many like terminology, right? So many differing, and I was trying to capture and write down all the different like laws and I don't so much here, just so rich. So thank you for kind of sparking our minds to think about, okay, so what next? And so any questions, if you want to raise your hand. I see there's a question in the chat. Let me go ahead and read that. We'll start here from Kara. What are your thoughts on the relationship between Indigenous data sovereignty and AI tools like ChatGPT that harvest and distribute TK and TCE for non-Indigenous created, designed, tested AI?
So, and here I'm just going to give you my personal like views, which are totally uninformed by the high-tech world because I'm not a high-tech person. But from from my perspective, one of the things that I find problematic on an ethical level with AI and that kind of program is that you're programming a machine to use a human form of consciousness. And human consciousness has always been part of the world of the sacred for Indigenous peoples. It's a way that and this is where spirituality is different than religion. The idea is that through your spiritual sense, you can connect to the creator, to your ancestral generations. That is what informs the way that a human being in these societies keeps to a certain standard that is set up around, and I'll just use this for the sake of argument, a concept of Indigenous wellness. So that's not the deficit thing. The concept of Indigenous wellness is restoring the community to health, individuals to health after these catastrophes, but in a way that takes the best of that ancestral legacy and leaves it for the children, and it grows and it changes. Now, new technologies have to be part of that, right? Because obviously we're in a society where technology is major. But what we don't want is to delegate that consciousness to a machine that has been programmed to think, to act as its creators have thought and acted. That is delegating consciousness in a way that is potentially very, very dangerous. And so I often wonder about that. One of my colleagues at University of Arizona, who is a tech person, he's a scientist, he did some experiment and programmed this AI. And he showed us how the level of the questions really change it, right? Because there are oftentimes assumptions embedded in the questions that you ask. And those are actually interpreted by this machine consciousness. So the way that you frame the question can get you to a completely different outcome. Whereas in sort of the traditional sense, you have an ethical duty as a human being to know it's a bounded universe. It's not an unbounded universe of moral conduct with respect to the environment, with respect to other people. You as a human being keep the anchors. You know them, you keep them. If you delegate your consciousness to something that can be informed kind of behind the scenes as it is programmed to do a certain thing, that to me is a very dangerous world. So bounded versus unbounded knowledge, and how do we know the right way? That's the ethical question. Those are things that I'm planning to get more clear on as I do my research over my sabbatical, which starts next week, thank goodness. But that's an excellent question, big picture question, very important.
Are there other questions? And if not, I can ask one on my list. So I'll ask one of mine. I'm curious as to what you're seeing future-wise when it comes to more on the legal practices, specifically about when needing consent. I think, like you briefly touched on it, and this ties to, of course, privacy concerns and personal identifiable information and all of that. But what's being done, like at the international level, because it trickles down then to, like you said, to then the local or the nation level. So are there any beyond the two, like UNESCO, you said it's working on some of these issues and World Intellectual Property, but that's specific for IP. But is there anything that you've seen recently in like laws or any bodies that are really looking at that, like when you need consent?
So this is a very important issue on so many levels, and it's kind of cross-cutting. The international human rights framing of Indigenous people's consent is around things that are very important to them, the environment, their own, community. There's an ethic at the international level of free, prior, and informed consent. That is what serves the interest of Indigenous peoples in making sure that their self-determination is honored. Self-determination internationally belongs to all individuals, and it belongs to all peoples. So that's why that ethic is free, prior, and informed consent before Indigenous peoples will be able to consent to any of these practices that impact them. At the national level, it's different. So we have a notion that Indigenous peoples should have the right to engage in consultation with federal agencies around the management of public lands, or with the National Institute of Health around, big health studies, so that they have the right to engage in consultation, to express what they would like to happen. But the agency is the one that actually decides and has a fair amount of latitude to make that decision, and taking out any potential claims that end up in court or something like that. So there could be a reason for courts to intervene, but usually they don't. So the idea is, as long as you give them the right to consultation, and then they can say what they would like to happen, the agency ends up making the decision. And that's how we got the Oak Flats crisis, right? Because the agencies will often decide to do things that are economically beneficial, even if there is a burden or harm to Indigenous peoples. Similarly, in the health studies, it depends on when the data was collected. So if the data was collected before the NIH kind of mandated a consultation, or, in some cases, the tribal government does have the right to consent. If it's going to take place on tribal lands or tribal members, like they have to consent to that. But a lot of this happened before those laws went into place in the 2000s, right? It was really in the latter half of the 2000s that we got those innovations in NIH practice. So things were collected a long time ago. They're still housed in these collections, and researchers can still access them. The blood was collected during the 50s and 60s from tribal members, and there weren't restrictions at that time. So the ethical practice would be to say, let's draw an international human rights law and say, we shouldn't be using that then. Even if there wasn't a protocol for consent in the United States, you still shouldn't use it without the consent, free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples in 2023. But I don't think we're there yet in terms of the domestic law.
Great. That's where I was kind of like, I don't know where we're at. That's why I wanted to ask you. And it's very so many integral parts, because then there's privacy, right, concerns and issues, and then like the ownership, which you talked about, and all these differing layers. All right, so we have a few minutes. I want to see if others have questions. Very, very interesting, and like for students, I know there's several students on the call. For those of you interested in this work, do you have any questions about maybe how you can get started, or even, Rebecca, do you have recommendations on, if a student wants to learn more about this specific, say, just Indigenous data sovereignty as a whole, like where would you recommend? What's a good text they should go to? I provided them with your bio, your link, so they can look at your research. But are there other recommended, researchers or authors that maybe they should take a look at?
Yes, my colleague at U of A, Stephanie Carroll, who was the public health researcher that I first met when she was an assistant professor in 2016, but she's now, doing amazing scholarship. Stephanie Carroll has written a number of articles with other researchers, and she's written a book with Maggie Walter, who's a Indigenous scholar from Australia. And I do have a chapter in that book, and I can send you the citation to that book. But that book has a really good collection of current essays about a lot of these issues as they affect Indigenous peoples in different countries and from different disciplines. And then several of our students at U of A have been publishing their work because they've studied with us, and they're now taking it to the next level. I love these questions from students because my students are usually much more conversant with new technologies and what is happening in new technologies. So one of my law students who's now graduated and working for a law firm in California, Dylan Dobson, he did a wonderful article about Indigenous data sovereignty and data practices related to several parts of tribal administrative practices around environment and natural resources, and this idea of these digital contracts. So there are digital contracts, and there are different ways to kind of navigate that world. So he published that piece, and he also has a new piece that is going to be out in another few months, and it is about kind of the 2.0 world, because we're moving into digital currencies. And that is happening globally, and certainly Indigenous peoples are going to have to participate in that. So the main point that he's making in his work is that tribal governments can't afford to be left behind as these new technologies roll out. And I think that is where a lot of the student work is going, because you guys are very conversant with those technologies and practices, and will be using them in your work.
Thank you for that. And I found the text, so I put the link in the chat.
Oh, you're wonderful. Thank you.
Well, and I want to capture it for those that are here in case you want to click on it and check it out. And then Yulia did share with us that Stephanie Carroll and her colleagues are working on a new article that will appear in Library Trends special issue on Indigenous librarianship, just on this topic, hopefully coming this fall.
Right.
So excellent. And as many of you may or may not be aware, Yulia, my colleague, teaches the Indigenous librarianship course at San Jose State in the iSchool. And then we have a whole host of other faculty that teach other courses specific to privacy or data governance, etc. So we have a lot of opportunities for our students to learn about these topics within a variety of our courses.
That is so impressive. Thank you for sharing that. How common is it for schools to offer a course in Indigenous librarianship or Indigenous data governance practices? Or is that, I honestly don't even know how common that would be.
I don't think it's very common. It may be becoming more important. Jessica mentions it's common in Canada. But yeah, here in the US, I'm not sure exactly. And I know like our course, I'm not sure how long our course has been around, but it hasn't been like, it's not, one of the primer or was way back when. But it's definitely, I think, a necessary course and should be integrated into all MLIS programs, and even for records and archives.
Wow, that's wonderful. Great work.
We are a little bit over. I just want to give, if anyone has, a comment, a question, this recording will be posted on the college YouTube channel. So it usually takes a week or two because they just want to make sure, capturing everything's accurate. And then if there's any questions, I did put your link that has your email address in there at that link, so they can reach out to you if there's additional questions.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I'm more than happy to chat with people by email or phone or Zoom.
Wonderful. Well, I think we'll wrap it up since we're just over. And there's some thank yous, a lot of thank yous coming in the chat, as well as agreeing about the Indigenous Cultural Librarianship course is incredible. So thank you to Yulia for working on and teaching that course. And many thanks to you, Professor Tsosie, for being here and taking the time and sharing with us about these really important issues that we all need to be considering and taking action on for the future.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's been fun to be here, and I really appreciate everything that you put into this wonderful series. So thank you.
Thank you. Everyone have a great day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.